Hi folks, welcome to another episode of The Hole on the Corner. I am Dan Peterson. I go by the handle Dr. Rockter here on YouTube, and I'm slightly crooked here today, kind of like old Batman villain scenes. In this episode, we're going to look at Chapter 7 of Past Master, called On Thunder Mountain. And the structure is roughly that they leave this town, Goslar, that they're in. They climb up Electric Mountain, and then they have to battle their way back down into the savannah. In a little more detail, they have this sort of debate kind of about ecclesiology in the town first, and then they have a Catholic mass, and then they begin to climb this mountain, and there's weird phenomena, and in the midst of it all, Scrivener, one of the two mechanical men, tells this story about how the programmed persons longed for this mechanical king. It's really fascinating. And when they get to the top, they meet up with Walter Copperhead, the necromancer, who is reading these entrails of a giant bird. And then from there, it says that they look back down on the vast expanse of the planet Astrope that they can see. And it is described as entrails, planetary entrails that they're looking at. And then there's this battle with the mechanical killers in the midst of this like hyper intense lightning display in which they see these giant faces in the sky, which are said to all be sort of one face of the void. And once they've got back down to the bottom, the few who survive, it says that they've been transfigured by this experience of both intense light and intense darkness. And you may recall that I said the last chapter, chapter 6, in which they're traveling through this feral region, is basically my favorite chapter of the novel. Although these days it's starting to contend with chapter 10, but we'll get to that. And I had said that that previous chapter could work as this like standalone story that you could put in anthologies or something, which I still think, but in this novel, it forms a sort of diptych with this chapter. So it's two chapters that they're going through this feral region, but this is centered on climbing the mountain. Now I want to pause here just a moment and kind of remind us of what we're doing in these videos on Past Master. I know that around an hour on each chapter may seem like a deep dive into the novel, but I've tried to explain from the beginning that I'm actually quite skimming along the surface here. And in order just to get through enumerating the many things and themes of this novel, chapter by chapter, takes some time. And I'm more or less sort of trying to raise some of the questions about the novel or that the novel poses, rather than actually getting into detailed discussions of those issues. And occasionally I'm pausing for a good few minutes to explore these possibilities a little bit and maybe suggest some interpretations. But there's a lot going on here and a lot of complexity that would require much more discussion, even just of some of the points. Not necessarily trying to cover absolutely everything you could discuss in any given chapter. That would take their own separate videos of an hour or more just to discuss a chapter or a part of a chapter. And my initial plan had been to do this overview, which is what we're in. This is an overview, believe it or not. And then start over again and go through in detail, taking a much longer time, which for a few of us would be a very exciting prospect, I believe, to participate in, to listen to. I know I would love to hear somebody do that. I would listen to 20 hours or something or more of somebody in a detailed way just going through a discussion of Past Master. And I am not opposed to creating that kind of content for the very few who would probably want it. But as my commitments and so on have made it so that I'm very intermittent on YouTube right now, this has taken a long time just to do the overview, and we're only halfway through. So for the time being, once we get to the final chapter, I'm going to leave it as an overview. And then with some guests and also on my own, sometimes I may go back and just look at certain pieces of the novel and themes and so on from time to time. But the project at that point will be a let's come back to it from time to time sort of thing, and we'll move on to other works by Lafferty, both short and long. But I hope that even this kind of lingering overview is pointing out the things that need to be discussed, some interesting possible interpretations and the richness of the whole project, just on this novel alone, much less the body of Lafferty's work. And as I've said before, for those not so familiar with Lafferty, I really do think of him as an author in the ilk of, thickly layered, complex sort of novelists, whoever that may be for you. I think of the likes of Cormac McCarthy or Thomas Pynchon. I'm not a big Thomas Pynchon reader, but that's what I know of him, or Don DeLillo or whoever. I've read bits of that kind of stuff. I've read a ton of McCarthy. Or again, in science fiction, the likes of Gene Wolfe. And in all honesty, I'm not exactly sure who else is quite like that in science fiction than Wolfe. I mean, Le Guin, certainly, Joanna Russ, from what I've seen, has those qualities, but I'm not as sure how many people might be quite to that Wolfian extent of like, there are layers and layers and layers here, and there's no way to definitely settle on this is the final last interpretation of certain things. So it's an ongoing community discussion, that kind of thing. I'm sure there surely must be others in science fiction, but my point being that Lafferty is one of those types of authors. If you read enough, I think it should be evident, although as I've constantly said, he has a way of hiding that initially, and not entirely. You sense it in some ways, but in other ways it's deflected through humor and concision of prose and all kinds of things. And it's on rereads that you go, my God, there is so much happening here. And much of it ties together in big ways that are hard to grasp onto, but that are sitting there teasing you, going, some of this coalesces, in pretty big ways. But again, I would reemphasize that, as Matt from Bookpilled said when he reviewed The Reefs of Earth, that Lafferty is teasing you, I suppose, if you want to call it that, in a way a little bit different than Wolfe, at least as the way some of us would see it, where Matt thought that Wolfe was. And I've heard many people say this, fans of Wolfe say, he's like, are you smart enough to figure this out type of thing. And a lot of people feel really respected as a reader by that, and I understand that. Whereas Lafferty, it's just not his tone, or I don't know, just not really what he's doing. It's not about smart and stuff. He is very smart. He's very erudite, and it requires a certain level of readerly commitment to kind of get into those things, and some research will be required in those kinds of things. But the tease there is a little more comic in a very broad sense, and very structurally collaborative with readership and readership's creativity, per Lafferty's own writings and things he says about this kind of stuff. So I just want to make that qualification about saying that Lafferty's teasing us that there's a big picture that coalesces here. So with that, let's get back into this. So when they awake in this chapter, the emperor provides another one of these capsule descriptions of the group. He says, "Why, here is a dead saint from old Earth, the devil kid of Astrobe, a necromancer of unlikely powers, a transcendent Ansel, a priest of Saint Klingensmith, an avatar who burns up bodies, and Pilot Paul, who is a broken-faced old warlock." So now Evita, who has done battle with the devilfish, and who has told her history with sort of wanting to court the devil, court Satan, is now so associated with that, because she's been called like this sort of almost like a teenage witch the whole time. Now they're calling her the devil kid, which is just fascinating because she's definitely one of the overt Christian characters of the story. And we have Walter Copperhead mentioned again. He's a necromancer, these unlikely powers. And we won't go into it, but I do think it's significant that the Ansel Rimrock is called transcendent here, which I think speaks to the origins that they've spoke of. When the people from Earth arrived on the planet, it seemed to cause some of that species to transcend into this more human-like consciousness. But also I think it speaks to numinous qualities in this species that I've noted before and I get vibes of throughout, and we'll eventually get to this term eutheopathic, which they'll use in a later chapter to describe their mental powers, which also speaks to this transcendence, I think. And Maxwell's moving from body to body is now described as burning up bodies, which is interesting. And for some reason, Paul here is called a warlock. I don't know if that's sort of a little joke about him, or if we're meant to think he has some kind of magical type powers. Maybe it's just speaking to the fact, because it calls him Pilot Paul, speaking to the fact that he's, as he said, a competent pilot in both mediums, time and space, and that the novel describes, especially for Hop equation space, that one has to be a bit maladjusted to even go through that space. And maybe that's a form of having warlock type powers. So then it says that the green robe priest monk called Father Adopter, it says simply that he said Mass. Then it describes the Mass this way. It was a simple and clear Mass with a surprisingly intelligent sermon, and the uncanny miracle came shockingly and vividly alive at the consecration. It was as though the heavens opened on command and the Spirit came down, which is what happened. Now that part makes me laugh every time. I just think it's this like amazing little rhetorical move that he makes. He just doesn't really get into the Mass hardly at all, except to make kind of a broad, strong claim about it being an actual miracle that happened, the Spirit coming down and the transubstantiation of the bread and wine into the flesh and blood of Christ, so that all the participants are participating in that miracle, constituting themselves as the church, the body of Christ. And as he says, it's as though the heavens opened and the Spirit came down, which is what happened. And it's just so fascinating because he took all this time to describe the blasphemous mechanical Mass back in the city, Cosmopolis, in this vivid, exciting detail. And here when he presents the real Mass to him, it's deep in the novel, off in a corner. In the Farrell strips, it's just like a few sentences, and he's just going to be like, yeah, man, it's real. What more do you want me to say? I'm not sure why he says the sermon was surprisingly intelligent, but he does use a handful of descriptors here that suggest things about what's happening in a Catholic Mass. And he says that the miracle itself was uncanny, which is unheimlich, the feeling of being not at home, something strange within the house, as it were, and that there's something shocking and vivid about this, and then he just leaves it at that. And thinking of the Eucharist, the communion, the taking of the bread and wine, as uncanny, got me thinking about a Flannery O'Connor story, who was also a Roman Catholic, who kind of ended her career because her life ended right around the time that Lafferty was just starting his career, and she was a relatively young woman at that time when she died, and he was an older man when he started. Just a kind of interesting little overlap there. And nobody really talks about O'Connor and Lafferty together. I may try to do that because I'm currently obsessed with Flannery O'Connor. Having read her when I was young, coming back to it and being just so blown away by it. Okay, let's not get into that. But her short story, The Temple of the Holy Ghost, there was tingling in my mind, so I went and read it. And I was like, yeah, okay. There's something here about juxtaposing and overlapping so-called freaks of nature or what have you with the Holy Communion, with the Eucharist, with this uncanny miracle of Christ being present in the bread and wine, and that there's an uncanniness here, a liminality, a hybridity, if you will. And so I think it's two Catholic imaginations doing that in unique but overlapping ways, both dealing in the grotesque or the holy as revealed through the grotesque. And in Lafferty's case here, there's nothing particularly grotesque about the Eucharist, and there's not really in O'Connor's story either. It's the associations with things we consider freakish or grotesque, and I say that with heavy quotes, especially if you go and read O'Connor's story and see what that's about. And O'Connor, like Lafferty and like so many authors I love, Cormac McCarthy, etc., is problematic, frankly. I'm just going to say that on various levels. But it's not always easy to see when and how that's the case. And I can't totally tell in that story. And let me just say my empathies, not really sympathies, but empathies with those, disappointed and or struggling with the Neil Gaiman thing. I've never been invested in Gaiman at all. I've used him a lot as a spokesperson for Lafferty, but I've enjoyed some of his work, but I'm not that bothered with it. No offense, but it just doesn't mean almost anything to me. So I'm not as floored by this stuff, but I feel bad for those who are. And of course, it complicates how to reference him in regard to Lafferty. Some things have come out about a favorite author of mine, Cormac McCarthy, recently that are complicating things for me, so that's more where I'm struggling. Anyway, as regards juxtaposing quote-unquote freaks with the Eucharist, recall that Lafferty has set up this group, and we've just seen in that little capsule description that this is a group of freaks, or as they say of themselves, they're an aberration, that that they're wandering from the normal, and that the sort of attempts at utopia are bound to, as it says, throw off these sorts of reactions to create this grouping of people. There's a lot of, liminality and hybridity in this very group, and it is they, rather than like the perfect people of Cosmopolis or whatever, that are celebrating the actual Catholic Mass and experiencing this miracle. So just some things to keep in mind. Now, this leads to a couple more theological things before this chapter really gets going. And that's that, again, it's reiterated that Thomas feels a little bit of faith in the mornings, and that he can believe for a little while in the mornings, and is impacted in that way by this Mass. And we're also told that it was a Mass because there's different kinds of Masses with different liturgical content. And this was a Mass for those about to die, which leads to a discussion about whether the institution of the church itself will die or continue on. Indeed, like sort of whether it can die, which has been brought up earlier in the novel. Now, a thing that's interesting to me about this whole discussion of the church in various parts of the novel, it's one of the central, I would say ecclesiology is one of the central concerns of the novel, ecclesiology being the study of the ecclesia, the assembly, the church. One of the sort of fields of theology. Like you've got pneumatology, the study of the spirit, eschatology, the study of the end things, Christology, the study of Christ and the nature of Christ and all that, soteriology, the study of salvation and so on, so ecclesiology. But what's interesting here is I noted before that with the whole utopian society and city and so on, Lafferty gives almost zero description and spends the entire description of the novel on all the strange things, whether that's Hop equation space or these feral regions or the slum cities, etc. That's where the vivid descriptions happen. But I hadn't noticed before this reading that equally he does that with the institution of the church. There's no description of that, even in its remnant like this. There's no vivid, even like many, I think, Catholic authors would have taken this opportunity of the Mass to spend a few pages just really spelling this thing out and evoking it, and maybe evoking the miracle of it, etc. But Lafferty gives almost like this equal ground, this equal playing field as regards these sort of opposing, as he thinks, opposing ideologies of utopia and the church. Neither really gets evoked. They're just kind of said, which is just fascinating to me, because for Lafferty, the church, the Mass, the Eucharist, all these sorts of things would be the center of reality and his central concern ideologically with his work. But in this, and I would wager to say really in all of his work, it's all about that place in between, in terms of fiction, in terms of art, in terms of exploring life through art. Lafferty's imagination just inhabits and narrates this middle ground, if you will, between nothingness and the divine, if we want to put it in those terms that, this novel seems to put them in, which is fascinating. And also, I just think that's good artistry. That's appropriate. It doesn't matter really what your ideology is or where you land on these different things. That's the ground of a novelist, of a fiction writer, of various sorts of artists. We don't just get to everybody knows that that's like bad art or propaganda or whatever when you just, really focus on this thing that you think is perfect, or even this thing that you think is evil or something. You have to get into that ambiguity of the middle earth, as it were, that we're all living in, and see how the ideologies fare in there. And I think Lafferty's a good artist in that way, despite sometimes to me being a bit over the top with sort of ideological, not exactly proclamations, but disquisitions from time to time, some of which I find way more interesting than others. But though he may do that from time to time, the vast majority of what's happening happens in this ambiguous middle ground. Now, I hope I haven't lost people already by getting into, not even massively getting into theology, but mentioning it and mentioning things like ecclesiology and stuff. Let me just suggest that a topic like ecclesiology is one of the single most urgent topics of our time, of our moment. If you're interested, who isn't? If you feel impacted by, who doesn't? What's going on in American politics and elsewhere in the world with just everything that's going on? However you view that, and I certainly view a lot of it as the potential rise in fascism or what have you. So much of this is driven by, rooted in, or related to people's ideas of what it means to be a group of people formed together in some idea of the divine, of spirituality, of a sense of understanding of what the cosmos is and what people are and what the planet is. And again, particularly, so much of it is about Christianity, the Christian church. And I think it's been way too tempting for way too long for so many people to think to just be blissfully secular, quote unquote, and think we're past all that and that's for a handful of, quote, freaks. Or it's a harmless thing that some people do, or it's a very harmful thing that some people do, but the answer is more science or some such thing. But the concerns of a novel like this, of like, who are the chosen people of God? And even if they become a remnant, will they last? Will it flourish again? Or various concerns about what is the relationship of church and state, Christianity and politics. This is a burning issue of most times in the past couple thousand years, and certainly in ours. And whilst Lafferty certainly has a very strong ideological bent here that he is sort of promoting, as I say, it's a work of art that brings up this stuff for us to discuss, and I think it's important to discuss. And I think it's important to discuss with respect if we can. I think Lafferty as an artist garners our respect. It's you may not want to have this conversation with somebody that you feel is belligerent or uninformed or whatever it may be in your life or online or whatever. But Lafferty and other great, say, Catholic novelists like O'Connor, or Christian artists or religious artists or what have you, that create something meaningful, powerful, and complex, give us an opportunity to talk about this stuff in intelligent, meaningful ways. Now, I'm not here going to get massively into that, but I'm saying this novel brings that up, and we can have that discussion, and I hope to circle back to it in some way and talk about it, because I'm really struck this time around with how much of an issue this is for this novel. So there's a note. Tell me what you think. I don't get enough discussion on this channel. I need more comments. So let's get into this if you have something to say about it. I will mention offhandedly that a few short stories, or a short story and an almost novella, that Lafferty deals with the idea of a Christian remnant in a sort of dystopian setting that make great short companion pieces with something like Past Master would be the short story and Walk Now Gently Through the Fire, and the, I think, kind of novella called Ishmael into the Barrens. And I think readers vary as to how they find these stories, because he does get overtly religious in some of them and even polemical, I would say, particularly in Ishmael, which has to do with, not directly, I think, with abortion, but, reproduction and issues around that. And I find it a very exciting read. I think it's a cool dystopian story. And it has some beautiful elements in it and some very experimental elements. But in some regards, I find it a little ideologically heavy-handed, a little mean-spirited in some ways. It's funny. He's making fun of hippies in it. It on some levels, it's not unwarranted, and it's kind of funny, and it's critiques that, post-hippies would make, punks and whoever else, in certain respects. And often, often for different reasons, but still. But it also, it's needlessly caricaturing in some ways. But for fleshing out the themes in Past Master, I think these stories are useful. And I think they have some of his best imagery, both stories. I've loved and Walked Now Gently Through the Fire for a long time. It has its issues, but there's something about it that really works for me. So I mentioned that here as well. As Thomas says about this issue, "It was a pretty thing. It was a pretty complex of things," Thomas said as his early morning faith began to withdraw from him again. "As a child, I lived it, and as a young man, I still respected it. In my maturity, I still call it the noblest of all superstitions. The Church of the Saints lived quite a long while, and historically I seem to have an ironic part in it. It died meanly in civilized Astrobe, I understand, but I believe it will die more quietly
and harmlessly here in the ferals.
And I think, in some ways that is a sentiment that many of us have, many post-Christians or ex-evangelicals, ex-evangelicals, whatever, etc. I think it's a problematic way to look at your past with religion for various reasons, but a very understandable one. But I think there are more meaningful ways to critique one's involvement in that or the religion itself. And again, I would point to the podcast Death Sentence. And they don't always get it right for me when it comes to discussing religion. They're like hardcore Marxist, materialist, atheists. But generally speaking, they have a great, and some of them come from religious backgrounds, they have a great respect for this stuff and get that it is more than just a noble superstition. It's one of the big ideas in history that has a lot of substance and complexity. And some of them have, read deeply in it and these sorts of things, the actual thinkers of Christianity and philosophers and so on. And they have a certain amount of respect for it, maybe in certain ways admiration, at least for some expressions of it or what have you. And at their best, they leave it as a like their stance is strong and they know what they believe or disbelieve, But there's a certain open-endedness to the way they look at it that doesn't sort of shut down that whole thing. So anyway, I would point to them as an example of how you can, be strongly against it, really, and yet respect it and have a way to talk about it that invites meaningful discussion. But the priest, Adopter, responds to Thomas that nothing dies quietly in these feral regions. He says,
"Whatever is set on here will shriek and shrill if it be killed, and it will return to life again and again. Even the meanest reptile dies hard in the ferals, and should a great thing do less, it will not lie down and die quietly. But why are you so afraid of being associated with superstition? Is it not a superstition of your own to climb the mountain?"
So, for these guys, the church is not going to go out quietly. Obviously, there's some alarming possible thoughts in regard to that. And I find the end of this novel troubling in some regards in its evocation of violence. So we'll get to that. But in the previous chapter, recall that Adopter had said that superstition, he called it the beyond belief or overbelief. And that because of things like that, this feral region was called the psychic force, the libido of Utopia. And that it was the psychic powerhouse of Astrobe. And again, there's just complexities to get into here. Like, what is it saying here? Is it saying that when belief is not put in its right place, that it has to become exaggerated, and there's monstrosities involved in that, and or that there's kind of a point in so-called overbelief, that whilst it's important to understand the difference between a superstition and a genuine religious belief or something, superstition has its place as something almost generative. I don't know. These are the kinds of things you got to get into. But all the repressed material and so on, including the church, in the feral regions just dies and rises again over and over. But as to this quote-unquote superstition of climbing the mountain or mountains at all, Thomas says that that's the one thing at this point that he faults the utopians for. As he says, they have never lifted up their eyes to the mountains, and that they're blind in this. And he does ask, what's the good of gazing at a pile of rocks? And people have historically asked this. Not everyone at all times has felt the sublime when looking at mountains. Some have felt something sort of ignoble, which to me is a bizarre response, but it's there. And I think this is a good example of where I'm not sure Lafferty evokes his satire of utopia well enough. Sometimes, I just don't see almost any utopian society outside of a very cartoonish one, cartoonish in an uninteresting way, because Lafferty does cartoonish in an interesting way, as I've talked about before and as we're about to see. But this paper thin version of utopia where they wouldn't even look at mountains, I think a utopia would be, a dystopian utopia would be more subtle than that, where they would look at the mountains, but then you could show how their engagement with them is somehow faulty or lacks something. But that's me getting pretty nitpicky, because I don't think about that much when I read this passage. It's just interesting. Okay, the utopians won't look at the mountains, but we're going to the mountains. And as Thomas says, he says he's going to give up this kind of stuff when he becomes world president. He says, but this day I am hooked on the mountain bait, which is very interesting phrasing given the previous chapter where they caught this very large, monstrous sea creature that ended up just being the bait for a much, much larger monstrous sea creature, which was the devilfish. So if the mountain is the bait, is Thomas somehow associated then with the devilfish here? Or is it like, as we're about to see, the mountain they climb is just part of a greater range that is more intense than it. So it could be the bait that brings out the bigger devil mountains, which they are kind of evoked as we'll see. So it's interesting things going on there, but I love that idea of the mountain bait and that he's hooked on it. Now here the Emperor Charles tries to warn Thomas that to go up that mountain is to trap themselves, because the mechanical killers will come up behind them and surround them and they won't be able to escape and they'll all die. And Thomas is like, I won't die because they brought me here to be world president and the program killers know not to touch me. And he's like, yeah, but all these other people will die. And Thomas is like, hey, it's a test. If they can't make it through this, then so be it. We'll winnow out our numbers here. And Charles is very offended at this and thinks that Thomas has sided too much with Utopia. But the others in the party who are against Utopia sort of support and defend Thomas and say, no, it's fine. He knows what he's doing, but he doesn't know what he's doing. We're going with him. And if some of us die, so be it. And here we start to get more into Scrivener. It's Scrivener and Slider, two mechanical men that are part of their party, which is interesting in and of itself. And they've been going back and forth as to who might end up being more human or more anti-utopian, such that the killers would come after them, because as it stands, the killers just would ignore these two because they're mechanical men and no threat to the utopian dream. But here we learn, because of Scrivener's makeup, that mechanical men or programmed persons can be as much as 9/10 human and only 1/10 programmed or mechanical. And I don't know how much we're even supposed to think about whether these are sort of cyborgs or what have you. And I've been having some very interesting conversations on the Lafferty Facebook page, East of Laughter, with a professor of 18th century literature called John Nelson about this whole issue of what the programmed persons are, what Udin the nothingness monster is, and so on. And currently the plan is to have John on here and have some discussions with him about that and other things, because he's been doing an exhaustive sort of project of creating these documents on every single one of Lafferty's novels and short stories, kind of detailing what's going on and some interpretive possibilities that he's making available to people through that Facebook page. And he's very astute, and he's coming from the Catholic perspective, so he gets a lot about Lafferty in regard to that, and it's quite informative. So I'll be excited to have some discussions with him about that. But one of the interesting things that Scrivener says here is that the astrobe dream, Utopia, is, as he puts it, only half the thing. And he says, it must be conjoined to some other thing that I do not understand yet. And this is something that has been brought up previously in the novel. And I think there are some interpretive debates here as well. I've been taking it to mean that Lafferty is saying there is something not entirely wrong about Utopia, but it needs more than itself other aspects, like what's going on in the Feral regions and so on, to complete it. Whereas possibly some are still seeing it, people expressing this, it needs more of a blending between these things as still wrong views within the novel. So I'm not sure about that. But anyway, Scrivener states that he believes he's finally going to be perceived as a threat to the utopian dream, and he's going to have to battle the mechanical killers because they're going to try to kill him as a threat. And he's excited about this. He's like, my human side is going to win out. And we're going to get to that point, and I think there's some really interesting stuff there in regard to contemporary society and technology and so on. So, and as I've said before, and it just keeps increasing for me, this novel is really speaking to our technological moment with AI and other things in ways that I just hadn't seen so much before. So as they climb, it says that they're climbing a devil tower of magma and iron, rough and sharp and blood drawing. So you get the sense of this like primordial mountain. And note that we've gone from, in the previous chapter, a devil fish to now a devil tower explicitly. And I still have not unriddled what Lafferty is doing with the devil and the demonic in this novel, especially in relation to nothingness, because sometimes they seem conflated, and I'm not sure what the theology of that would be, especially given that Lafferty is likely working on an Augustinian and Thomistic idea of evil as privation, as a lack or absence of good. So how, does it have form and body? And how can the nothingness be a figure that is a thing, the devil, Satan? So interesting questions there. And I think, again, interesting questions for all of us, whether you're religious or not, about what is evil. Is it anything? And if so, what? And in all honesty, theologians have been some of our best thinkers in history about this kind of stuff, I think. But in this novel, it's as if evil and or nothingness, which are kind of the same, seem to have to inhere, particularly in natural forms and phenomena, whether that's some kind of predaceous beast or a mountain or what have you, or even in a person, the devil kid, a person, these things are not, on Lafferty's sacramental view, which sees all things as participating in the divine, these things are not evil in and of themselves. Just because you've got big fangs and you eat other stuff doesn't make you evil on that view. Certainly a mountain, no matter how scary and mysterious, is not evil, etc. And yet they're associated with the devil, who is evil, etc. So fascinating stuff going on there. Now, for me, I love weirdness, description, action. So it's at this point in this chapter that things get really fun for me. That's why I like the previous chapter in the Federal Regions much more, because it's just beat for beat, note for note, weirdness and action and strangeness and grotesquerie and what have you. Whereas this chapter has taken a while to get started, and there's more discourse of the kind that I find interesting at the philosophical level, but not always at the novelistic level. And this is the main novel that Lafferty does that for me. I feel most of the other novels, he gets that balance right or better. And some of them are more discourse and theory heavy than this one, by far. But the discourse and theory are much stranger and, to me, more fun.
Boy, the amniotic ontic webbing is torn, and some black galactic thing is born. The star shooting